I want to invite you to kind of mentally shift gears a little bit, because we're moving to a different sort of place in the map of the larger conversations that we're having than we just had this morning. This morning we're really talking about the emergence of identity and the relationship between sexual identity and gender identity and all those sorts of things, which really have to do with how do I understand myself, how do I understand the way I respond to other people, how do I understand my own inclinations in terms of larger gender roles in society and all of those sorts of things. I want to shift gears in a very different way to talk about marriage and how we think about marriage theologically. And the reason why we're talking about this, of course, is that in many Christian circles, this is the starting point. And for many Christians, resistance to LGBT issues is directly linked to the defense of marriage, right? So that this is, in their interpretation, what will be lost if they become more open and affirming, okay? So it's really important to think, all right, well, what do Christians actually teach about marriage? And how should we think about LGBT relationships in the context of the way Christians think about marriage? So it's because this, particularly in North American church culture, these two issues get really closely aligned with each other, and that's why we need to talk about it. Now, just quickly to recapitulate, I've talked with you already about forms of moral logic, not only asking what Scripture teaches, but why it teaches that. We've talked already about the inadequacy of gender complementarity as a kind of Rorschach blot. Matthew mentioned a little bit about that just now. You got to get people to spell that out in more detail. Talked about justice and love as being really important, necessary conditions of a sexual ethic, but not sufficient. In other words, you have to talk about more than justice and love. You can't avoid it, but you can't stop there. Okay? You have to talk about the meaning of sexuality, and as we're talking about now, you have to talk about the meaning of marriage. So all of that gets at what values undergird biblical discussions of sexuality and how might they be relevant to the issue of same-sex unions. And to get at this, we really have to talk, there's two sort of 25-cent theological words that really capture a huge amount of the Christian tradition's discussion about marriage, and that is the unitive and the procreative meanings of sexuality and marriage. And a great deal of understanding the Christian tradition is really has to do with an ongoing debate, and this started long before the LGBT issue emerged for the church at all, but there has been a centuries-old debate about how we relate these two components, which everybody recognizes as part of the Christian tradition around marriage, but which is more important? How do the two relate to each other? That becomes a central sort of issue. So I want to begin by talking about the procreative meaning of marriage and sexuality. Sex makes babies, and this fact is an important one and has been historically an important one in thinking about the ethics of sexuality and marriage. Now, for early church fathers like Ambrose and Augustine, procreation was not just a purpose of sexuality and marriage, it was the only purpose of sexual relations at all. And so for them, they're actually fairly consistent. Any form of sexual contact, gay or straight, married or unmarried, any form of sexual contact that is not directly focused on the bearing of children was considered by them to be immoral. Okay? So Augustine has a long speculation in his writings, for example, about what the sex life of Adam and Eve would have been like if they hadn't sinned. And he makes it pretty clear that they only would have had sex when they wanted to make babies. Okay? And Ambrose, another early church father who had an enormous influence on Augustine, took a similar tack. There's one place in particular where Ambrose talks about the excessive lust that might drive a husband to have sex with his wife while she was pregnant, right? And that would be highly immoral. Yeah?
Can I just ask a question? The Ambrose dude, so how did he justify the fact that there were no children until after the fall? Did they not have... Oh, Augustine.
Wasn't enough time. Okay? Yeah. But you know, get the point here. For Ambrose, having sex, if you don't actually intend to make a baby, and if there isn't the real possibility of making a baby, is always immoral. Okay? So Augustine and Ambrose are fairly consistent on this. The purpose of sex, and therefore the purpose of marriage, is procreation, period. And you know, we could cite some other church fathers who say the same sort of thing. That's why sex outside of marriage, of course, is wrong, because it's wrong to attempt to bring children into the world who can't be cared for in families, right? And likewise, in that frame of reference, same-sex relationships are inherently immoral precisely because they cannot be procreative. For the same reason that it's immoral for a husband to have sex with his wife while she's pregnant, the same moral logic applies to why men should not have sex with men. Okay? Exactly the same thing. Now, it's interesting in this regard to note, as I already mentioned to you before, that for the first 300 years of the church's life, including Ambrose and Augustine, this line from Romans 1 was understood as non-procreative sexual intercourse, not necessarily, I mean, lesbian sex might be part of it, but for the first 300 years of the church, this was always non-procreative, right? That's what the church fathers talked about when they talked about Romans 1:26. That it was against nature because it was non-procreative. And the same logic then would apply to male-male sex in the same passage as well. Now, it's interesting to observe that the Roman Catholic Church has, in more recent years, softened this stance to some extent. It's no longer argued in the Roman Catholic Church, as Augustine tried to argue, that the only time that sexual relations are morally acceptable if the couple is intending to bear children, right? That's what Augustine and Ambrose said. Now what the Roman Catholic Church says is that sexual relations have to be open to procreation, all right? And so artificial contraception is always morally wrong because then you're not open to procreation. But the rhythm method, even though you're intending to avoid contraception, is morally acceptable because you're still open to the possibility. You know, the bodies might not work quite the way you want them to, and you might get pregnant. That's okay, even if you're intending not to have children. So you can have sex intending specifically to avoid the purpose of sex, and it's morally okay. Right? That's the contemporary Catholic position. But you know, for most Protestants, you know, there's some tension between that and the origins of this procreative meaning of marriage and sexuality. It's worth noting in this regard that this procreative meaning of marriage and sexuality for the Catholic tradition is the central reason why same-sex relationships are wrong.
Well, I think a lot of male-male relationships are trying to get pregnant. It just isn't working out very well.
Yeah. Here's the most recent statement. Here's the most recent statement about same-sex relationships in the Catholic Church. This is a statement of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which declares that homosexual activity is not, quote, able to transmit life. And so it thwarts the call to a life of that form of self-giving which the gospel says is the essence of Christian living. This does not mean that homosexual persons are not generous and giving of themselves, but when they engage in homosexual activity, they confirm within themselves a disordered sexual inclination, and the last line is the most important, which is inherently self-indulgent. Why is it self-indulgent? Because it is unable to transmit life. Right? So you got a kind of bottom line position here. What's wrong about same-sex relationships is their incapacity to transmit life. They are non-procreative, and therefore they are inherently self-indulgent.
What's that document from?
The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Yeah, I think so. It's actually footnoted in my book. You can find it there. Yes.
So how do they justify if you're married and neither couple can have children?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh,
That's coming up. So in this sense, in the Catholic tradition, procreation marks the greatest and most important good that flows from our sexuality. So to morally accept a form of sexual relations that's not directed toward, or at least open to procreation, is to corrupt and confuse the meaning of sexuality at a very deep level. I mean, that's the kind of classic Catholic tradition. Now, from about 1930 onward, Protestants and Catholics have parted the ways on this. And so the way Catholics have to argue this issue of LGBT inclusion is a little different from the way Protestants do. And I'm going to talk, I talked a little bit about the Catholic view, now I want to talk some more about the Protestant side of things. Because around 1930 is when contraception began to be more reliable and more widely available. Almost all Protestants adopted the position that contraception was morally acceptable. And the Catholic Church said, no, contraception is not morally acceptable.
Do we know why?
It really has to do with the way this debate has played out in the Catholic-Protestant conversation is the relative importance of these two meanings of sexuality and marriage, the unitive and the procreative. And essentially, the Protestants say the unitive meaning of sexuality and marriage is central, not the procreative meaning of marriage and central. And therefore, sex simply to deepen the bond of love between a husband and a wife is a perfectly legitimate reason to have sex, quite apart from whether you either are able or even intend to have children. Okay? I'm starting on this procreative side, but you can see how we're going to transition in just a minute. But before I transition to the unitive meaning, let's talk about Scripture and the procreative meaning of sexuality and marriage. Does Scripture say that procreation is essential to marriage? Well, I want to make a distinction here between two different kind of ways of looking at this. Because on the one hand, procreation in Scripture always assumes and requires the context of marriage. Right? In other words, you shouldn't be having babies outside of marriage. Scripture always teaches that. It always assumes that. There are no exceptions. It would be difficult to sort of even imagine a context where Scripture imagines that having babies outside of the marriage bond is acceptable. Certainly the major reason for that in Scripture is that the care of children requires a stable household, right? And the whole problem with sex outside of marriage is it brings children into households that are not stable, and the good order of society and the care of children both require this. So Clearly, the teaching of Scripture is that procreation belongs in the context of marriage. And given the fact that in our society, 42% of all children born in the United States today are born to a single mother or to parents who are not married, this is a fairly live theological issue, right? And one that I think the church feels the force of. And there's a lot at stake in this for the church to encourage the bearing of children within the context of stable married couples that are more economically stable, that have more resources to raise children, and all of this, okay? But given that, is the inverse true? Does marriage in Scripture always assume and require the purpose of procreation in order to be valid or to fulfill its purpose? You see the distinction? Procreation always requires marriage, but does marriage always require procreation? Right? And that's a different question. And as you know from some of the stuff that I've already said, I think that that's not the case. Some people, however, want to say that the answer is yes, and they want to point specifically to Genesis 1, 27 and 28, male and female, coupled with God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. So here you have the creation of humanity as male and female and the call to fruitfulness directly sort of linked with each other. And yet what I would argue is this may support the notion that procreation always assumes and requires the context of marriage. It doesn't speak directly to whether marriage always assumes and requires the purpose of procreation. In fact, I think there are several things that suggest that that's not the case. First one, be fruitful and multiply is, when looked at the totality of Scripture, not a command, but a blessing. Moreover, it's a blessing that's given not just to marriages, but to the animals as well. Okay? So to use more technical language, in these contexts, procreation is not the essence of marriage or the esse, to use sort of technical language, but part of the well-being of marriage, or to use the Latin phrase, the bene esse of marriage. Right? So, as I've said before, the fact that Scripture never countenances the legitimacy of divorce is certainly part of the argument for this. It's also the case that when you have the story of the creation of woman in Genesis 2, there's absolutely no mention of procreation. In other words, when Scripture gets to the text that more clearly is intended to be a kind of foundational story about the origin of kinship, and I think also then the origin of marriage, there's absolutely no talk about procreation in any direct way in that text. Moreover, when you turn to another book of the Old Testament that has more to say about sexual desire and sexual pleasure than any other, the Song of Solomon, there's absolutely nothing about procreation in the Song of Solomon. So here you have right within Scripture this extensive exploration of sexual experience where procreation simply plays no part at all. So that's part of what suggests to me that procreation is part of it's a blessing of marriage, but it's not the essence of marriage, and marriages can't be dissolved if it's not there. Yeah?
Speaking from a Catholic perspective, like I know you said that for the Catholic Church is really the crux of a lot of their objections to same-sex unions. So I was wondering, since Catholics don't use Scripture as such a central model for our faith as much as Protestants do, what's like a traditional, like, speaking not only to experience in Scripture, but the traditional aspects of our faith that say, like, this is the way it's always been done, and why are you trying to upset that?
Well, I guess what I would, if I were arguing in a Catholic context, the first thing I would say is it's not the way it's always been done. Actually, the Catholic Church has changed its view on this. Ambrose and Augustine didn't say that sex must be open to procreation. They said it must be specifically intending procreation, and if you're ever having sex when it can't be procreative, that's morally wrong always. The Church no longer says that. And the Church marries couples who know that they're stale, or sterile rather. Sorry about that. Bad mistake. So, this move from intending to procreate to open to procreate really represents, I would argue, a modern shift as a response to sort of new discussions about contraception and sort of related issues. But I do think it's already loosened the Catholic discussion. And the question is, should that space that this greater opening in the Catholic conversation has created also create some space for committed gay and lesbian couples? It seems to me that's the way in the Catholic Church the argument has to be carried out. By the way, if you haven't discovered James Allison, any of you know about him? James Allison is a gay priest who teaches in South America. He's a Brit. Boy, if you want just the most amazing articulation within a Catholic context, I haven't found any Catholic that's more interesting or more creative to read than James Allison. And he's got a bunch of books that are on this topic. But I would strongly recommend you take a look at that stuff. James Allison, 1 L. Yeah. Yeah, just one, I got to tell you one story about James Allison, just as a sidelight. He came and spoke at Hope College, right near where I teach, when I was working on my book. And so I had supper with him, and then he was speaking to a group of folks, and you could tell this is a pretty burned out on religion crowd, And he talked for about a half an hour, and then there was a Q&A. And now he's wearing this black shirt with rainbow letters up here that say priest. Okay? And one of the first questions, this older woman stands up and she says, I was born a Catholic, but I haven't darkened the door of the church in 25 years because quite honestly, I can't stand all the crap that's going on there. How do you put up with all the crap that they've given to you? He pauses a minute and he smiles and he says, well, you have to begin with the doctrine of baptism. Because in baptism, you've already died with Christ, and that means you've lost everything. And that also means that they can't take anything more away from you, and that everything in life now is just a gift. And my jaw, I was just starting to write the book at this point, and all my anxieties about what this book is going to do were very high. And I listened to that and I said, I want to live that way.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. James Allison, read his stuff, his great stuff. So I think the fact that we have these extensive discussions about marriage and sexuality, don't say anything about procreation, confirms this what I've suggested, that procreation is important to marriage. It's one of the blessings of marriage, but it's not essential to marriage. It doesn't define marriage at its core. So if the central meaning of marriage is not to be found in gender complementarity, which I tried to argue in the first lecture, and if it's not to be found in procreation, as I've just argued, what is at the center of the Bible's understanding of sexuality and marriage? And here, I'd suggest to you this unitive meaning of sexuality and marriage, which this is a long established piece of the Christian tradition. This is not new stuff, okay? But sex is the means by which people become bonded to each other, the means by which two persons become one flesh. In the classical tradition, this is called the unitive meaning of sex and marriage. Or to put it somewhat differently, in the biblical vision, sex is profoundly metaphorical. It means something beyond what's happening with our bodies, okay? In other words, what people say with their bodies in the giving and receiving of the most intimate form of pleasure, people should also say with the rest of their lives in mutual commitment and love. Now, that's not just an LGBT issue. This I think, is at the core of what the Christian tradition says about the place of sex and why it is so closely related to marriage. As I tried to argue before, I think that's at the heart of what Genesis 2:24 tries to say about becoming one flesh. It's interesting, there's another text that makes this close link between kinship. You have the same word cling. All living beings associate with their own kind, and people cling to those like themselves. So again, this connection between clinging and one flesh, just another resonance that underscores this, this sort of kinship connection. Now, that's why, you know, we were talking before about Ephesians 5 and, you know, whether the sort of analogy between husband and wife and Christ and the church causes this stuff to break down. But I think this unitive meaning of sexuality and marriage is the central point at which the relationship between a husband and a wife is a metaphor for the relationship between Christ and the church. Not that Christ is male and the church is female, but that the two are bonded to each other in this deep, permanent bond of committed love. Yeah. Okay? It's this unitive meaning of sexuality and marriage that forms the central point of comparison between marriage and the relationship between Christ and the church. And this unitive meaning, I would argue, also is underscored in what Paul has to say in 1 Corinthians 6 about why you shouldn't have sex with a prostitute. You know, you're becoming one flesh with a prostitute. That's a sort of inherent contradiction. You're saying something with your body that you're not saying with the rest of your life. Now, that unitive meaning of sexuality, I think, lies at the center of the Christian tradition's critique of promiscuity of any sort, whether gay or straight, right? Sex is a form of bonding, and the failure to recognize this results in living into contradictions that will eventually destabilize our lives. Here's a quote from Rowan Williams in this essay that I was talking about the other day. Any genuine experience of desire leaves me in this position. I cannot of myself satisfy my wants without distorting or trivializing them. That's why masturbation, you know, is never going to finally get you what you want. You know, that's his point. But in this experience, we have a particularly intense case of the helplessness of the ego alone. For my body to be the cause of joy, the end of homecoming for me, it must be there for someone else, must be perceived, accepted, nurtured. And that means being given over to the creation of joy in that other, because only as directed to the enjoyment, the happiness of the other, does it become unreservedly lovable. To desire my joy is to desire the joy of the one I desire. My search for enjoyment through the bodily presence of another is a longing to be enjoyed in my body. Or as Blake put it, sexual partners admire in each other the lineaments of gratified desire. We are pleased because we are pleasing. Which just strikes me as just a marvelously insightful observation about kind of what happens in sex and how it is that sex actually bonds us to each other. Sex is not simply the satisfaction of desire. To make that kind of simplistic claim is the equivalent of what the Corinthians say when Paul is debating with them about sex with a prostitute. The Corinthians say, food for the belly for food, right? My genitals are for sex. I find sex, my genitals are satisfied, the world is admirably arranged, right? That's the Corinthian position, all right? And what Paul says is you can't do that, right? Because you don't understand what sex is for. It's not just about being gratified, it's about binding oneself to another. That, I would argue, is clearly what the Christian tradition says is at the very center of the meaning of sexuality and marriage. And that raises this profound question. If procreation, while enormously important, doesn't define the essence of our sexuality in general, or marriage in particular, and if the essential meaning of our sexuality and marriage which flows from it lies in the divine providence by which our desire for gratification, the Greek word there is eros, leads us into self-giving concern and sacrifice for the other, the Greek word there is agape, overcoming our self-centeredness by the one flesh bond with another. Therefore, can such bonds of commitment, intimacy, and self-giving be established between those of the same sex, or are they only possible between a man and a woman? So my argument is, if we penetrate to the very heart of the Christian tradition on sexuality and marriage, and if same-sex couples can fulfill this heart of the Christian tradition, why should we exclude them? Okay? You know, you may get the counter-argument to all of this. Well, the Christian tradition has never said this before, right? You're trying to base your argument on the Christian tradition, but the Christian tradition has always resisted same-sex unions. So how can you say that now the Christian tradition should be open to this, right? And we've talked about this before, but just to recapitulate, I think there are three new realities that have emerged that make the question a more pressing question than it has been in the past in the Christian tradition. First of all, the whole notion of sexual orientation that we operate with now, this awareness that people are exclusively, or at least some people are exclusively attracted to people of the same sex, only emerged in the last 100 years or so, as opposed to this notion of excessive desire, right? Secondly, the intransigence of sexual orientation in many places, right? That you know, it's really on the last 5 or 10 years, I think, that particularly conservative Christians have finally admitted, at least many of them, that reparative therapy doesn't work. And so you got Wesley Hill's book, you know, which is a kind of next generation attempt to get at this stuff. But that's really breaking new ground that conservative Christians have never even crossed before. Do I need to swap these out?
No, keep going.
Okay. And then finally, we have seen very recently the emergence of legal marriage for gay and lesbian couples. So we have the opportunity that the Christian tradition has never faced before for a community to gather around gay and lesbian couples that want to live in a long-term relationship and actually support them. And whether or not there were long-term relationships in the past, there has never in the past been a culture that would actually provide legal, social sanctions and support for such relationships. Now, you know, Christians may debate whether or not that's there, but it is there in some places. So there are possibilities for long-term committed relationships that have the support of the community that never before existed. So the question is, does all of this new data create a new situation where we have to go back again to the core of our tradition and figure out how to deal with it in light of this new situation? Yeah?
I just want to bring up a quick point on the second one.
Yeah?
Because I think while we can all agree that most people know that sexual orientation
This one.
yeah, is highly dismissive or change, the kind of statement that is said, at least in my church, even by a conference president or our SDA church president, was that God can still help you from any sin that you have. So while he's not saying that he can change you from homosexuality, it's implying that any sin that you have, God can change you. God can help you with that.
Yeah, you know, and it does seem to me that, you know, this is one of those places where somebody can say that, but we have now at least 30 years of experience with reparative therapy that seems to suggest that, you know, he may say that God can do that, but the actual experience of people is that God doesn't do that, you know. And I think you have to take that seriously. And on what basis then can he still claim that? You know, people who have their legs cut off, God could, because God can do anything, grow their legs back again. But show me when that happens, right? You know, I mean, there are certain realities that are just not part of the way that God acts. And you know, we just have to come to grips with that. Yeah.
something I always say. People say, "Oh, Gilbert, you're shortening the arm of God. He can change you," you know. And I say that it's not that God can't. I'm trying to tell you that He won't.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good segue into the last thing I want to say, and then there'll be opportunity to talk some more. And that's about celibacy. First important thing about celibacy is it's really important for ethical reflection to make a distinction between celibacy as a vocation for life and celibacy as something that's part of a season of one's life. Right? Celibacy is a permanent commitment and as a season of one's life. All Christians have to confront the reality of celibacy in various seasons of their life. You know, Scripture gives no license to gratification under all circumstances. This is true even for married couples, right? There are times when it just isn't going to work to have sex, and deal with it. You know, and Christian tradition expects people prior to their becoming married to avoid sex. At the same time, the Christian tradition is pretty clear that celibacy as a lifelong commitment is not for all. And Paul makes that pretty clear. In 1 Corinthians 7, there are people in Corinth who are teaching this. And note these particular verses. Paul says, "I wish that all were as I myself am," that is, unmarried, "but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another of a different kind. But," he says, "if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion." All right? So marriage is the solution for people for whom sexual desire is not amenable to control, and it's not amenable to, or it's not part of one's vocation in particular. Yes?
Could you almost say that that it would be better to masturbate than to be aflame with passion?
Well, one might say that, but it's interesting that Paul doesn't say that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
What he says is, and I think what he's sensing there is this deeper purpose of sex, that ultimately masturbation is not going to satisfy what the deeper longing that's part of sex is, which is this longing for connectedness. You know, it represents in that sense a kind of trivializing of what sexual desire really is at its core.
In Torn, Justin Lee talks just about that.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, later in verse 28, "If you marry, you do not sin, and if a virgin marries, she does not sin." But then further on, "If anyone thinks he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong, so it has to be. Let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry." Now, what's interesting is this is in response to people in Corinth who are saying, if you are going to be truly spiritual, you should not marry, and you should not have sex. You know, these are Corinthians who say that the true spirituality sort of transcends the body. Right? You should rise above all that so that you don't need it anymore. And what Paul says is, no, marriage is the answer to the sexual longing, because the sexual longing is not finally a matter of just release. It really is finally a matter of bonding. Okay? And so, you know, as we've said at several points, you know, once you recognize for many people the intractability of sexual orientation, what you are saying to them in essence is, you must be celibate, right? You know, this is not just a calling for a season of your life. This is the calling for the whole of your life. And that sounds an awful lot like what the Corinthians were saying that Paul is correcting here, right? That it's a calling for some, it's not a calling for all. And in particular, if passion is difficult to manage, the solution is marriage. So my central argument here in trying to engage the Christian tradition is, if the heart of the Christian tradition is this unitive meaning, the relationship between sex and long-term bonding, if that's what lies at its core, why not invite gay and lesbian folks who have difficulty controlling their passion into that same sort of committed relationship?